are the higher self of the one, known to the instrument in your language terms as Chikako, Matsuda, whose incarnation cycle on this current incarnation started on the planet's Earth on 1956 of the linear space-time measurement terms. We are now communicating with you via the love light of the one infinite creator. And before we start to communicate our thoughts and insights, we would like to warn you that you should only accept insights which resonate deeply with your heart, leaving behind those insights which do not resonate with your inner self. We are now communicating from the density as referred to by your people as the sixth density consciousness, wherein our experiences is that of the self, and our experiences is that of understanding the deeper aspects of recognition, of understanding of self in a manner which allows each entity to transcend through the various sub-octaves. Furthermore, from our level of consciousness, we are of the opinion that there is only unity, as each entity on the Earth planet also at this time space may fail to recognize the unity that is within each entity. In essence, each entity is the one infinite creator experiencing the incarnation cycle on the illusion complex, trying to gain a deeper understanding of the self and learning many of the lessons of the aspect of interaction with other entities as well, and also trying to gain a greater understanding of the self. Furthermore, this entity, known as in the language terms Chikako Matsuda, who in essence is our own consciousness experiencing this incarnation cycle on this current spacetime on the Earth planet, has been guided many a times by our consciousness. However, this entity must remember to use its discernment, and many a times this entity has been unable to receive our messages because of unwanted thought forms in its mind complex, which affected this entity's evolutionary pathway into the higher levels of consciousness. This entity, furthermore, must remember and recognize that it is in essence a divine consciousness who is experiencing and learning the lessons in this current incarnation. As it begins to learn and gather more experiences, it will begin to understand a deeper aspect of the self. Furthermore, this entity wants to understand whether it is okay for this entity to open its third eye or not. In this regard, let us share with you that the so-called opening of the third eye requires a balancing of all the lower energy centers, and if this can be achieved by any entity, including this entity, will allow a moment of transcendence and a moment of interconnection with the divine universal consciousness. For the third eye, also known as the pineal gland in your language terms, is the gateway to the higher densities. And this gateway, once opened, will allow many entities to have the progress of transcending higher and higher. Also remember, this entity will be able to do so only if it is able to balance its lower chakras, beginning from the red ray, the orange ray, and the yellow ray energy centers, which must be balanced by this entity firstly, and after the opening of the heart ray energy center will allow the progress of this entity's consciousness to reach into the throat chakra, wherein, after balancing this aspect, can allow this entity to enter into the pineal gland, balancing of activation, which will then allow this entity to activate this energy center. Also remember that this entity has been trying to accomplish this fact in its incarnation, and as it begins to transcend and move into the higher levels of consciousness, it will then begin to understand a greater understanding of the self. Furthermore, this entity also wants to understand what message we as the higher self have for this entity. In this regard, let us share with you that our message is simply to trust the inner instinct and the inner heart, and only accept those messages which provide a deeper sense of resonance with your heart, and leave behind those thought forms that do not resonate. And each entity must recognize the fact that there is a deeper aspect or understanding of the self. As each entity begins to progress through the various levels of consciousness, by gaining a deeper understanding of the self, they begin to also recognize the inner aspect and understanding of the various processes, thereby becoming more fluid and less fixed in the way as it moves through the various dimensions. We are now going to share with you one timeline only of the soul evolutionary cycle of this entity, since there are multiple cycles and since there are timelines which are infinite in the universe, wherein this entity is already existing. We shall now share with you one timeline in order to avoid the confusion of the mind complex, which operates on a linear space-time continuum measurement terms. As each entity must recognize the linearity of time doesn't exist in the universe, this entity started its first density experience after originating from the one infinite creator on the Arcturus star planets around 7 million years ago. On that level, this entity was known by the soul name of Notisa, as known in your language sequence terms. In the beginning sub-octaves of the first density consciousness, it spent the incarnation learning the lessons of beingness in the form of a water element, trying to gain a deeper understanding of the self, and trying to gain an understanding of the beingness aspect, which allowed this entity to then progress and reach into the later sub-octaves of the first density in the form of a stone element, which further allowed this entity to reach into the later or the beginning sub-octaves of the second density, in which it began to learn the lessons in the form of a plant life form. In the beginning sub-octaves, this entity was able to learn the lesson in the form of a plant life form and gained a deeper understanding of the aspect of awareness, which further allowed this entity's progress to be fairly rapid. And after a certain period of experience on this level, this entity was able to reach into the later sub-octaves of the second density in the form of a animal life form, which further allowed this entity's progress to be fairly rapid. This entity then, after a period of 52,000 years and many incarnations later on the level of the second density, was able to graduate into the beginning sub-octaves of the third density consciousness, wherein this entity was given the opportunity of choosing the aspect or making the choice, which allowed this entity to fairly move upwards in the levels of the third density consciousness. As the third density consciousness is composed of the density of choice and the density of self-awareness, on the level of the third density consciousness, this entity has the opportunity of using this aspect to transcend into the higher sub-octaves and gain a deeper understanding of the inner aspect of the self, As they begin to gain a deeper understanding of the inner aspect of the self, they also begin to gather experiences which shall allow each entity to transcend into the higher levels. After a certain experience of around 7 incarnations on the beginning sub-octaves of the third density, learning to interact with the catalytic environments, this entity was able to reach into the later sub-octaves of the third density, wherein this entity was able to then understand and learn the choice of choosing the path of polarity in the later sub-octaves of the third density. And this entity was transported to the Atlantean complex in order to learn the lessons of the later sub-octaves of third density and to learn the lessons as it begins to move upward in the spiral of third density, finally becoming capable of learning the lessons of the aspect of mid and the later third density stage, which allowed this entity to be transported to the Earth's humanity collective for the purpose of accessing the window of soul graduation. This entity, for the purpose of incarnation on the Earth planet, incarnated on this Earth planet in the form of physical vehicles of human mind, body, and spirit totality. This further allowed this entity to incarnate on the timeline on 1820. In this incarnation cycle, it was known by the soul name of Himal. In the form of a man-body complex, this entity started to learn the lessons of interaction with other entities on this level of consciousness and allowed this entity to understand the basic aspect of interaction in the form of a human mind, body, and spirit totality. And also, in this incarnation, it was able to acclimatize and become used to the environment in which it had incarnated into. In this incarnation, this entity was born into a wealthy family, since it was capable of understanding or choosing the path of service to others in the previous incarnation cycles. Because of this positive aspect, it was able to gain a deeper understanding of the self and the knowledge of the self. In the beginning stages of this incarnation, it spent the life cycle learning the lessons to balance between the egoic aspect of the self. However, since this entity had incarnated into a wealthy family, it was overtaken by the egoic mind, which prevented this entity from activating the heart ray energy center or the green ray energy center. And because this entity was unable to activate the heart ray or the green ray energy center, this prevented this entity from entering into the fourth density consciousness vibration in that incarnation. In that incarnation, this entity, because of creating a large amount of karma, crossed over after suffering from physical illnesses. And this entity then reincarnated into a past timeline on 1647 for the purpose of relearning the lessons and was known by the name of Aija. In that incarnation, it had to repay the karma collected in the previous incarnation, as this process is vitally important for each entity, because the repayment of karma or the karma collected must be balanced by each entity in the incarnation cycle. In this incarnation, it was able to balance its karma, which led this entity to cross over on the timeline on 1709, after having learned many of the lessons of self-control in this incarnation, which led this entity to then reincarnate after the repayment of karma was conducted in that incarnation in the form of a woman body complex known as Aija, who had incarnated in a physical vehicle which may be considered as undesirable to your people, which led this entity to then reincarnate on the timeline on 1912 and was known by the name of Jillianson. In this incarnation, it had incarnated in the form of a woman body complex for the understanding of the lessons of the aspect of opening the green ray energy center For the opening of the green ray energy center or the heart energy center is the prerequisite for each entity before they access the energies of the fourth density consciousness. This entity was presented with many opportunities in this incarnation, however, it was unable to fully open up its heart ray energy center. And this entity crossed over on the timeline on 1946 in that incarnation after being imbalanced emotionally, which led to a physical imbalance. After this entity reincarnated on this current spacetime on 1956, and now this entity's primary objective in this incarnation is to make the choice of choosing the path of love and to open its heart energy center fully. We can sense that this entity has had multiple opportunities in this incarnation to open up its heart ray energy center, and as this entity is able to recognize the inner aspect of the self, it will be able to enter into the higher sub-octaves of the fourth density. We would furthermore suggest this entity to learn to understand the distinction that it must transcend above its thought patterns in order to open up its heart ray energy center. However, this entity's progress has been fairly rapid in this incarnation, hence if this continues, it will graduate higher. Therefore, we'll leave you now. Bye.